I hope you'll forgive the changing angles and me getting up to pick up a dumbbell or whatever the case might be. But obviously, as a lifelong, not only cineast, movie fan, film school graduate, but somebody who has recently talked about two of the best films that this individual made. It's really awful that it would be terrible if he passed from a heart attack. It would be terrible if he died from cancer. We're talking levels of bad here, right? But I don't know, the way that the story was reported yesterday, I don't think that it should have been reported in the fashion that it was. And what I mean specifically, why make an announcement that two people are dead at the home of a certain famous person? Why even do that? Why not wait till you have confirmation? Is it so important to break some version of a story? Because that made it sound like, and I remember many years ago that William Shatner, was it that his ex-wife drowned in his pool? That was also a horrendous story, but like the way they reported that story was strange, but that ended up being what happened. So I didn't hear anything different. I just saw this story. Famous filmmaker Rob Reiner, two people found dead inside his home, and I did not, why would I think, or maybe I'm nuts here. Maybe you thought, oh my God, he's dead. How naive am I? Is that it? I don't know. But I just thought it was some kind of a terrible tragedy that two people died. It could have been like Gene Hackman and his wife, which we all know how bad that was. Unnecessary, especially for his wife to have died the way that she did. But when it was confirmed that it was Rob Reiner who passed, I just kind of felt numb. And I remember as a kid watching episodes of All in the Family, and I didn't really understand what I was watching. You know, Archie Bunker, just move this a little, Archie Bunker gets all of those kind of laugh lines and always making fun of his son-in-law, Meathead, that he always called him. But the discussions, the arguments between the two of them, and ultimately the respect that formed within Archie Bunker, even if he, still liked to needle him. It wasn't just him thinking that this guy was this guy is a fucking idiot. But within the context of a sitcom, the screaming matches between the two of them, I feel like they kind of advanced the narrative of the country. And that was something that the creator of the show, who made it to 100 and passed not that long ago, Norman Lear, this is really what he was trying to do. Almost all of his shows, there was an attempt to do something other than simply entertain. And let me stress again, there's nothing wrong with doing that. One of the greatest movies ever made, Preston Sturges' Sullivan's Travels, it makes that exact argument. There is nothing wrong with making people laugh or making people feel without having any kind of a larger message on society. But in the works of Rob Reiner, I feel like there was an attempt to do that. I think there was an attempt to connect with people and make people feel something other than laughter, have some tears, get scared, whatever the case might be. And before I really was able to sort of study movies at the academic level, I often had trouble figuring out who directed which film between Rob Reiner and Ron Howard. And I mean, that's kind of pathetic, but to me, they made, at least at certain points, they made similar films. Like, if somebody had told me when I was younger that it was Ron Howard who directed The Princess Bride, okay. For example, I thought that the movie Parenthood, which was Ron Howard, Think Parenthood was Ron Howard, but you understand what I'm saying. Those two guys made similar films, and they had somewhat similar backgrounds in the fact that in both instances, their fathers were famous within the business. Ron Howard's father, Rance Howard. I mean, Rance Howard was in a lot of Ron Howard movies. He was also in Chinatown. Like, he had major supporting roles in a lot of other films. And of course, Ron Howard's brother, Clint Howard, he gets the biggest laugh line in Apollo 13 when Kevin Bacon's character has forgotten to, Jack Swigert, he's forgotten to file his taxes. And he said, I forgot to file my extension for the income tax return, and everybody he's laughing, and there's Clint Howard goes, that's no joke, they'll jump on him. But Carl Reiner was a famous comic actor, comedian who worked with Mel Brooks. And then Rob Reiner, after the success of, Ron Howard had a huge sitcom success with Happy Days, and Rob Reiner had the enormous sitcom success with All in the Family. And then he moved on to cinema. And even if he had some misses, and famously, my favorite film critic, and I'm sorry if I'm, stumbling over my words a little bit. It is still pretty early, and I didn't get to sleep till 1:30. But I'll try to, pick it up as we go along here. But Roger Ebert wrote a book in the early 2000s called "I Hated This Movie," and that quote came from his review of Rob Reiner's film from 1994, starring Elijah Wood and Bruce Willis, among many others, called North. And this was one of those circumstances where Roger Ebert and his TV partner, also the late, great Gene Siskel, were in complete agreement on a film. Every now and then, as in the case, same year, Hoop Dreams, they both believed it was a documentary. That was the best film of 1994. They both despised the movie North, and there was a moment early in the review where Ebert almost thought that Siskel was not going to agree with him, that maybe he thought the film was okay. And when he realized, no, this is horrendous, almost like, thank goodness that I'm not completely losing my marbles here. But that movie was such an outlier in Rob Reiner's filmography. When you think about This Is Spinal Tap, which is kind of, it's a mockumentary. That was something that really wasn't done to the extent that maybe in later years it would be. And that's a film that I know many people that have it among, their favorite movies. But you think about Stand By Me, which, that was probably the first Rob Reiner film that I saw. And how that film balances humor and tragedy and what you would call pathos with trying to make sense of childhood and childhood friends. And are people who are important to you when you're 12 going to be important to you when you're 22, when you're 32, when you're 42? Usually not. And this is not something that I would ever thought about as a kid. That's a movie that plays differently as an adult when you kind of understand Richard Dreyfuss' character. You have friends, but it's nothing like when you were a child. Do you have friends like that? Jesus, does anyone? It's such a great film all around, and another Stephen King adaptation from a book which was not a horror novel. And The Running Man wasn't a horror novel either, and that came out the following year. But my favorite Ron Howard films, films which really cut deeply, and that in that instance doesn't mean that they made you feel pain or suffering or anything like that. But I love The Princess Bride. I never read the book. I'm a William Goldman fan, but I saw the movie. I've seen it probably at least 10 times start to finish. And that's just a fantastic film. And, Rob Reiner's kind of long-term friendship with Billy Crystal was a key component. Billy Crystal as Miracle Max to me is the highlight of the film because the character is so absurd. But that entire movie, you have this rodents of unusual size. That's the name? Yeah. It's poking fun at itself. It's poking fun at how absurd it is, as you wish. And, I recently talked about Misery, and I just talked about A Few Good Men. I haven't talked about my two other favorite Rob Reiner films, which would be When Harry Met Sally, which is a film that, honestly, when I first saw it, I called bullshit. I didn't believe anything that the movie was telling me because I hadn't experienced any of it. To me, the notion of a relationship, this is bullshit. And people would correctly say, Jared, You ever stop to think? Like, how did you get here? Somebody's having relationships. You shut the fuck up. These are the kinds of conversations I had when I was in my mid-teens, in my late teens. But When Harry Met Sally is ultimately a hopeful story. It is not supposed to make, there are certain elements that are supposed to make you angry. Billy Crystal's character doesn't take life as seriously as he should, doesn't take women as seriously as he should, and he has certain precepts which, well, you can say, well, of course he's right, or, well, of course he's not right. And the irony of that movie is it kind of has its cake and eats it too, because ultimately your takeaway could be either. It could be that men and women can't be friends, or it could be that they can be such great friends that they're actually soulmates and they're meant to spend the rest of their lives together in a relationship, in a romantic context. And of course, in that movie, you had Rob Reiner's mom delivering the immortal line of, "I'll have what she's having." And another similar moment from the Ron Howard filmography, the moment where his real life mom, who plays the mother of Jim Lovell in Apollo 13, gets to deliver the line at the darkest moment in the film, where it looks like all of the astronauts are going to die in space, and it's going to be the biggest tragedy, not only the history of the space program, it's going to be one of the worst things to ever happen, because the whole world's going to be watching us fail and watching these poor brave men die. Where they tell her what's going on. Blanche, there was an issue on Jimmy's spacecraft, and there's all kinds of issues. We don't know if they're going to make it back, whatever. If they could put a washing machine in space, my Jimmy could land it. And that got the big laugh line in Apollo 13, and I'll have what she's having. I mean, you could say that's top 10 great moments in any movie of the last, 40 years. But The American President is a film that I haven't spoke of on the channel, because it's a movie that I really like. I don't necessarily love, but it is interesting to me how Hollywood has always, they've done things in phases where you won't have any movies about a certain topic, and then suddenly you'll get a bunch of them. And you're supposed to sort of compare and contrast. So for example, in late 1995, you had Oliver Stone's Nixon, and you had Rob Reiner's The American President. They came out right around the same time. They were both awards contenders. We knew that Nixon was going to get some awards buzz for sure, but we didn't know about The American President. But The American President is to me, the best attempt to try and show what the presidency kind of a little bit was like, at least back then. It's it's gotten crazier as time has gone on with the social media era, which was just sort of in its infancy in the middle 90s. But Reiner had an ability to elicit some of the best performances that his particular casts ever gave. I mean, there are people who would say that the best that Michael Douglas ever was in a movie was not when he won an Oscar for Wall Street. It's his performance as the president, I think as President Shepard in The American President, that he comes across at once as regal, commanding, demanding, but also very, very human. And these things don't happen in a vacuum. You look at, for example, the number of award wins and award nominations, actor, actress, supporting actor, supporting actress in Clint Eastwood films, and you say, well, that can't be an accident. It's because the filmmaker knows how to connect with his cast. And you could also say, because the filmmaker was an actor. And people who worked with Clint always said, well, he knows what it's like on this side of the camera, so of course he's going to be good at directing actors. But Rob Reiner knew how to elicit the best performances from his cast. Even, as we say in Stand By Me, working with child actors, which, it doesn't seem necessarily like it would be that difficult, but it is. And this is another thing where Spielberg has always been known to be really good working with younger people, because in his case, he's somebody who is kind of like a big kid, whether he was in his early 20s directing, Joan Crawford on the TV show Night Gallery with Rod Serling, or, even in his older era. Just sometimes it's having a little bit more patience for a child actor who's having trouble hitting the marks and hitting the line at the exact moment, and not blowing up, not getting angry. But, I don't think that I have anything to offer on the larger issue here. We had a terrible story here on Long Island within the last like couple of weeks, where you have this kind of beloved deli that was run by a husband and wife who I think they were in their 70s, and this story came out that they were murdered by their son, who had been in and out of rehab, I believe, and in and out of mental health institutions that he had been treated at various points as an outpatient, as an inpatient. And one of the, to me, negatives of social media is like the idea of everybody having a voice to some extent. That's good, like there's nothing wrong with that. But people just throwing down blanket statements saying, this is the problem with society, and then they could come up with any number of different things, and they're going to point to it and say that this is really the problem. Mental illness is, in and of itself, it's a problem, it's a quandary that there's no solution. There is no surefire way to keep somebody who comes across a little bit like a ticking time bomb. Maybe we don't know that. But short of just throwing people away into institutions and just letting them live out their days there, other than that, what are you supposed to do? And Rob Reiner's son, Nick, I'm embarrassed to say that I wouldn't have even known that. If somebody said, do you know this Rob Reiner's son's name, I would not have known. So I was not that in depth. I didn't realize that his wife, his second wife, of course, he had been married to Penny Marshall. That I knew, but that he met his wife while they were making When Harry Met Sally. I didn't know that. I never went deep with Rob Reiner, other than to point out the number of great films, and the stupid thing where I would always get him confused with Reiner. I didn't get him confused physically, but the fact that I kept getting their movies mixed up. And City Slickers seems like a movie, speaking of Billy Crystal, that could have been directed by either Rob Reiner or Ron Howard, but it was directed by Ron Underwood. You can drive yourself nuts, and I understand that's more from a comedic standpoint. But we don't know why people do the terrible things that they do. That why in some cases you have people where their demons threaten to overcome them. And yes, we can talk about in the movie business, we know this, where their demons threaten to overcome them, derail them, end their career, end their lives. But something clicks and they go the rest of their lives, not like a quote unquote normal person. When you're in recovery, you're always in recovery. You talk to recovering addicts and they will say something like that staying sober, if it's drugs, if it's alcohol, it's a challenge every day. It's an ongoing process. I'm sure we're gonna learn more about the specific mental health issues of Nick Reiner, but today it's just terrible. It's such a tragedy on so many levels. And let me also point out, Rob Reiner lived a full life. Right? He could have died from some terrible disease at age 77 or age 78. I think he was he 77? His wife was 67. I think she was 10 years younger than him. But it's not the point. It's the way this happened. And even within the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, and there's going to be a lot of tributes and remembrances and commemorations of Rob Reiner's life and his work. And he was known as an actor's director. I remember in a movie, Postcards from the Edge, which was, speaking of another showbiz kid, Carrie Fisher, the mom Debbie Reynolds. In the world of that film, Shirley MacLaine plays the kind of Debbie Reynolds character, and Meryl Streep plays what was supposed to be the Carrie Fisher character. Well, in that film, Rob Reiner is he's in there as an actor. And there's a scene, I remember the first time I watched the movie, I didn't understand the purpose of this scene, where they're on the set and he goes to visit Meryl Streep's character, she is somebody who has abused substances. She's in recovery, and now she's back to work, right? She's working. And he basically goes in there and he's all nice and smiling, and it's great to see you. We remember at the Oscars, whatever he says something like that. And he's going in and you're wondering, why is this even in here? Why would we need 2 minutes of him buttering her up? What the hell's the difference? And then we realize that he's in there because the insurance company, not the insurance company, we need you to pee into a cup. And he's all so nice. And no, I just want to see how you're doing. And yeah, here's it. He was a pretty good actor. He wouldn't have ever been a big star. But as a character actor, there are movies such as that where, when I think of Postcards from the Edge, I think of the Rob Reiner scene first. He just was someone, if Rob Reiner was not on the level of Spielberg, Scorsese, Coppola, and few people would put him on that level just as a filmmaker. But you don't have to be that to be a fantastic filmmaker. And Rob Reiner was fantastic. As I mentioned, that the movies that he produced, that he directed, Castle Rock Entertainment, that was his company. And I even told the story with Clint Eastwood a couple of times where Clint's agent had him up, or wanted him to be up for In the Line of Fire, and some executive at Rob Reiner's company, we're not in the Clint Eastwood business anymore, and then all of a sudden Unforgiven is buzzy and people are going nuts about it, and suddenly Rob Reiner's company, and Rob Reiner had nothing to do with that. But it shows how many different pieces of the movie business he was in, still making occasional supporting performances. He did a film with, I want to say it was Michelle Pfeiffer and Bruce Willis, The Story of Us. Not good, not good. And I don't even remember if Rob Reiner directed that. But in that film, he has a couple of really cool dialogue exchanges with Bruce Willis where they're kind of ripping on each other. And he was always good. He just had a very likable presence when he would appear on screen. And he was somebody, I used to look forward to seeing him in movies because I was a fan of his work as a filmmaker. It is just, I never met Rob Reiner. It was highly unlikely that I was ever going to meet Rob Reiner. But it just feels really awful today. And that's so obvious, right? But it's a really sad day. Not just for Hollywood, but for creative people in general, and for those struggling with mental health. You just hope that it doesn't end up in this. I just saw an interview, and you've probably seen it or are going to see it, where it was from a number of years ago, where Nick Reiner was involved in a movie called Being Charlie, and it was something that he wrote, and it was just an interview with father and son. And again, you would never in a million years think that something as horrific as yesterday would have happened. But here we are. And, for all of the, celebrities being out of touch, and they shouldn't talk about anything other than make movies, whatever it is, this is a day where there are people who are worth tens of millions, hundreds of millions, who are grieving. And what do you want them to do, right? Anytime you lose somebody in any business who you have known, who you have loved, who you have worked with in a different industry, when someone meets as tragic a fate as this, man, it stings. It more than stings. He probably had another 10 years. And, this is what we're left with. This is what we have to do. We have to just look at the person's career. We can look at it in awe. We can count the number of his movies, which, were in our top 5 or top 10. And I know plenty of people, I mentioned this in the Misery episode, there are plenty of people that have Stand By Me as their favorite film from him. There are people who have This Is Spinal Tap as their favorite film from him. Then there would be those who say, no, the American President, Michael Douglas, the most presidential looking actor of the day. You could get into all kinds of goofy arguments. And speaking of Clint Eastwood, when he made Mystic River, he got to meet the then governor of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, and they had lunch, and Clint was asked afterwards, well, what do you think of our governor? And Clint he said, if I'm ever going to make another movie where there's a president, I'm going to cast him because he kind of looks like he could be a president. Which is what I thought when I first saw the posters for the American president. I said, man, I would not have necessarily imagined Michael Douglas. You're usually a very cold and calculating kind of an actor, how many unlikable protagonists did Michael Douglas play in his career? A lot. But in that movie, despite the fact that his character has a terrible job, he kind of found the humanity. And Michael Douglas gave a performance with immense warmth, which in his salad days, when you think about Michael Douglas, right? Great movies. Wall Street, not exactly Mr. Warmth. They called Don Rickles Mr. Warmth, not because he was really Mr. Warmth, but because he was ice cold. But the number of movies in Michael Douglas's career, Fatal Attraction, Black Rain, Disclosure, right? Basic Instinct, Falling Down, The Game, not exactly a likable kind of guy. And the character in that film could have also come across as great. He could have come across like an asshole. But they found the humanity in the character. And yes, Michael Douglas, brilliant, right? But Rob Reiner, behind the camera, he knew exactly what he wanted to get across in that movie. He just happened to have a perfect cast. Man, Michael J. Fox as the kind of George Stephanopoulos character. He's funny. You know, I'm the guy that always ends up going to jail when some shit goes wrong. So great. And Martin Sheen, and obviously Annette Bening. And that was also a film that Siskel and Ebert agreed on. They both had it in their top 10 for films released in 1995. But this is just a very sad day. And I wasn't even sure if I wanted to talk about it because, like, what can I possibly add to the discourse here, right? I'm just a movie guy. Yeah, I grew up being a movie fan and ended up going to school for it and working as a screenwriter for 2 decades, but it's just, you feel bad. And I know there's an instinct among certain people to get angry when we kind of, and I'm not talking about idolatry, but when we put celebrities onto a certain perch. But if people in the movie business have put out movies that we love, I mean, why do you have to, don't get mad at somebody for celebrating their life or celebrating while at the same time mourning the fact that they should still be here with us. So those are my very rambling and I hope not overly disorganized thoughts on Rob Reiner, who unfortunately was killed yesterday along with his wife in what they were pretty sure was the son who had been struggling with mental illness for, you know, we don't know how many years exactly or whatever the mechanics were, but he's gone, and it is a tragic and very, very sad and gloomy day, not just for people in Hollywood, but people who loved so many of his movies. So put this away and wish you a proper goodbye on this frigid Monday morning. It's kind of fitting that it's so cold outside, but yeah, try to be kind to each other, and peace.